Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.
Tonight, an interview with Garret Hardin, a human ecologist who, among other things, argues that the freedom to breed can destroy us all. Good evening. Garret Hardin's 1968 article entitled "The Tragedy of the Commons" has, simply put, become a classic. It is studied, fretted over, embraced, and rejected by biologists, ecologists, political scientists, philosophers, and sociologists, among a few others. Hardin's arguments about population control, food distribution, personal freedom, and immigration have often been controversial, but they still are ideas that have shaped the way many experts have, over the last 15 years, come to deal with all of those difficult issues. Garret Hardin has a long and distinguished career as a scientist, a writer, a teacher, and a lecturer. He spoke at Boise State University last night, and he joins us tonight for a conversation on some of his thoughts on what we might call the state of the human condition. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
I don't suppose you've been asked more than 100,000 times or so to explain what you mean by the tragedy of the commons, but let me start, as a way of starting, to ask you to do that.
All right. It's really very simple, that if you regard some of the resources as being part of a common pool that people can draw upon, in keeping with Karl Marx's statement, to each according to his needs, in other words, help yourself, such a commons encourages irresponsible behavior. Or to put it another way, those who behave irresponsibly will benefit at the expense of the ones who behave responsibly. And because of this, because it selects for the wrong sort of behavior, I say this creates a tragedy in the end. And finally, the commons are overused and exhausted, and everybody's worse off.
In other words, if I could restate that somewhat, pooling the world's resources, be it food or energy or whatever it might be, will only hasten the demise of all of us.
That's right. Because if you follow that rule, according to your needs, help yourself, then the populations grow, and people keep taking out of the commons, and finally there isn't enough for anybody.
Your arguments run contrary, it would seem to me, to almost every humanitarian, altruistic, moral, ethical belief that most of us hold.
Well, many people see it this way, but that's because of developments in ethical thought in the last century, which I think are mistaken. I mean, for instance, Karl Marx has had a great influence, and there are many people who don't think of themselves as communists or admirers of Marx who think that that idea of to each according to his needs is splendid. As a matter of fact, it sounds much like Christianity. But one has to get into that, the idea of some sort of responsibility before qualifying to take from a commons. And if you do that, then you have a managed commons, and that's something else. And this, of course, is the idea of socialism. You can't just help yourself, but if you do your job, then we'll let you draw from the commons. But that's a managed commons. I'm talking about an unmanaged commons.
So we're really talking about personal, individual responsibility.
Yes, that's right. Either adopted because it's part of the culture, or imposed upon a person by law, because that's what the law says. You have to behave in this way.
Now, your writing most directly has been applied to the world population problem,
yes,
which you consider, I guess, the problem facing us now.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Yeah, it seems to me that over the last 10 years or so that it has become less fashionable to consider it a problem.
That's right.
It still is a problem every bit as much as we used to talk about it being?
Yes, the world's population will increase by 83 million this year, and that is the greatest numerical increase ever. Now, it's true, the rate of increase is slowly falling, but that rate you have to multiply by the base, and the base is rising, so the net result is that in terms of absolute numbers, the world population is increasing faster than ever.
So the birth rate might be declining somewhat, but people are living longer, and increasing, as you say, the base.
That's right.
So what do we, I want to get into some of your thoughts about what we do about that problem, but one of the ways, I guess, of meeting the demands that population has placed upon the planet has been very humanitarian aims to food for peace and programs like that. You argue that those are essentially all wrong.
That's right. I think any workable system has to be built on responsibility. And I think, first of all, I think it's a mistake to speak of a world population problem or a problem of world hunger. I think this is a great mistake because that implies somehow a commons. I think it's much better if you say there are 150 nations to speak of 150 different national population problems and then tackle each one individually, saying to each nation, since you demand sovereignty over your own affairs, as part of that sovereignty, you have to accept responsibility for managing your affairs. Now, I would call your attention to the fact that China accepts this, and China does accept responsibility for its population, and they've embarked on a program actually of population reduction. They haven't achieved it yet. It's going to be some time before they do, but that is the policy. But they are not saying because we have over 1 billion people who have great need, therefore we're going to call upon the rest of the world to feed us. China doesn't say that. China says we're going to feed our own people, and that means we have to control the numbers down to the point where we can do it.
Well, let's back up for just a moment, and let's suppose for a moment that under some scheme we were able to allocate the world's resources, everything, on divided up equally. Every individual on the face of the earth got the same as the next individual, be it food or energy or whatever. What would be wrong with that?
What would be wrong with that would be there would be no motivation to control the size of families. And so there'd be nothing to keep population from growing except the worst control of all, which would finally be starvation, which would do it. Finally, we would be dividing up food, say, for 10 billion people among 11 billion, which won't work. Then people just have to die in vast numbers.
Some have suggested, of course, in answering your theories that, that in effect that's what would happen under your scheme, that people in the United States or Western Europe would continue to live the kinds of lives we enjoy now, while much of the rest of the world would suffer the starvation and the death.
Well, you see, look at it this way. Whatever we do with respect to other countries, everything we do, no matter what we intend, also amounts to a message. If we send food to a country where people are starving, we're also sending them a message that we're kind people, and if you have greater need next year, we'll send you more food. Now, we did that, for example.
And what's missing there, excuse me, what's missing there is the incentive for the receiving country to do anything about its problem.
That's right. And there is a historical instance that fits in with what I'm saying. 1965 and 1966 were very bad years for the agriculture of India. Both years, we sent 10 million tons of food there, of grain there, which is enough to feed 50 million people. So I think you can say we kept 50 million Indians alive who would not have been alive otherwise. Toward the end of 1966, President Johnson notified the Indians there would be no similar gift in 1967. I talked with one of the Indian officials 4 years later, and he said they were very angry at the time, but he said it's the best thing that ever happened to us, because once we realized that we could expect no help from the United States in 1967, we buckled down to improving our agriculture, which we did, and also, he said, happened that the next year was a good year in terms of climate, which was fortunate. But he said the main thing was that we did what we should have been doing all along. And so from then on, we've been essentially feeding ourselves.
So those leaders in the world, and I recall the major economic countries in the leading economic countries in the world met last year in Cancun, or year before last in Cancun. Right. And there was a call for a new world order, a redistribution of these resources, an effort led in no small part by President Mitterrand of France, a socialist, and Pierre Trudeau, the former Prime Minister of Canada. So what they're talking about is just the absolute opposite of what you think should be done.
That's right. And fortunately, the countries of the world, the rich countries of the world, aren't paying any attention to those requests. This is a message that's given out by the group of 77, as they're often called, the poor countries, and the rich countries just ignore them, and I think rightly so. Or they make some sort of a pro forma statement that implies a certain sympathy, and then nothing happens.
if outright grants, if you will, of food or whatever are not proper, how can we send the right kind of message?
Well, the right kind of message, in principle, is development. In other words, not direct aid, but development aid. If we can help them develop their resources better than they're doing, then that is something we should be generous about, and in fact we have been. The only problem there is one of sufficient knowledge. We often don't know what they really need. For example, in agriculture, we have a splendid agriculture. We've had these agricultural experiment stations that have brought about great advances in the last 50 years, but this is all temperate zone agriculture. Most of the poor countries of the world are in the tropical zone, and there simply has not been the corresponding work there. And when we take them temperate zone agriculture answers, they may be the wrong answers for the tropical zone. So we don't always know the answers. That's the right thing to try to do, but we have to be very modest about our ability to do it.
Yet there, I'm sure, are farmers in this agricultural state and others who would say, boy, if we could just get the restrictions removed and the transportation existed, we could feed the world.
Well, in a sense, the world is fed. After all, the 4.8 billion people are alive, so they're getting almost enough food, but they're not living well, and they're increasing in numbers all the time. And at no time will you find vast numbers of people starving to death at that moment, you see, because the ones that starve to death soon starve to death, then you don't count them. But the World Health Organization estimates that about 800 million people are desperately poor and for the most part malnourished. They're still alive, but they're malnourished. And the possibility of improving their situation with existing agriculture is not very great. What people overlook when they hear of these large tonnages that we send elsewhere is that those are only a fraction of the world's food. For example, the 100 million tons approximately that the United States and Canada send to other countries, sell or give or whatever, that 100 million tons is only 10% of the world's needs. You see, the other 90% of the world's food is grown locally, and this just fills in the chink, so to speak. So that this is a marginal operation, and even if we expand our agriculture, it won't make much difference. And furthermore, any expansion is going to be at the expense of the well-being of the United States in this sense. When we take marginal land, start growing crops on it, we've had enough experience already to know that when you exploit marginal land, you usually ruin it. And so then you make dust bowls and things like that. So probably the marginal land should be left out of production.
There are others who would argue, I'm sure, and have in response to some of the things that you've written, that we have really, as a wealthy Western country, or wealthy Western countries, have not really made much more than a token effort, a modest effort, at trying to do what we're talking about here, which is to mount a massive effort to...
I wouldn't try to defend us against that. I would say that is a point in our favor. I hope it's only been token. And this is on the principle that the only way to really solve a country's problems is for the country to take a responsible attitude that it has to solve them itself. And the more we, quote, help them, the more we make them dependent upon us. We make them parasitic. And that's not good. It's much better to say, we're not going to help you. We'll give you all the information we can. We'll sit down and study these problems with you if you want. But in the end, you have to solve the problem yourself. You have to be self-supporting.
How have the Chinese managed to do that, or at least start to do that?
Well,
in terms of controlling their population?
Well, first of all, the Chinese, by ancient tradition, are the people will accept external controls far more than Westerners will. And what the Chinese are doing, they are using incentives and disincentives. They are giving more aid to the first and second born child, and then none to the third born in terms of supportive education and so on. And the families know that. And in terms of housing in the cities, there simply is no provision for a house that'll take 3 children. If you have 3 children, you got a problem, and nobody's going to solve it for you. That's not counted as housing shortage. It's just your stupidity. Well, that sort of pressure, together with a willingness to use contraception and a willingness to use abortion as a means of birth control means that each Chinese family, looking toward its own self-interest, says, we're crazy if we have a third child. Let's hold it down to 1 or 2. That's because the reward system set up by the national government works that way.
Would something like that work in a Western country, the United States?
Not without a lot of education, and it wouldn't work probably for 2 or 3 generations, because we have people who have a long tradition of resisting authority and trying to fight their way around it. We're a different people from the Chinese. I think what we'd have to do here is to offer rewards rather than punishments. And, for example, I think it would work if we had a reward system, say, that rewarded every young female, say from the age of 12 to the age 20, every Christmas gave her $500 if she had had no child during the preceding year. Now, that'd be an easy thing to verify because 99% of the children are born in hospitals here. So there'd be no surreptitious childbirths to speak of. So if she gets $500 every Christmas for not having a baby, that's motivation to avoid getting pregnant. It's motivation for her parents to put pressure on her not to get pregnant. And it will be the strongest motivation for the poorest people, who are the ones who would be harmed most by having a baby early. You see, having a baby at age 12, 13, 14, it cuts out education for the young person, it limits job opportunities, all sorts of things. But all those are harder to persuade them of, whereas a $500 check waved in their face may motivate them.
Well, we even have a tax structure in this country that rewards people for having
the wrong
more
way.
children.
It rewards them for having children, if anything. You see, we want to reward them for not having children. I think that is the way we would have to work a workable population control system in our part of the world. But we have to be convinced it's needed first, and so far people aren't convinced.
Why is that? I mean, you've cited some statistics already that seem to be widely accepted as the fact, but yet there is certainly something less than wide acceptance of the problem.
That's right. This is a very difficult problem because whatever population is, it's never a crisis. It's a crunch. It's a long, slow pressure, steady, day after day, month after month, year after year, and it doesn't have a sharp point at which you can say this is a crisis. It usually isn't. And the trouble with crunches is you get used to them. You bear up under them. This, in a way, is a great credit to us. We get, my gosh, if we go to hell, probably very soon we'll be bragging about the nice warm weather there. You know, it's just human nature to adjust to life no matter how it is. And this is the way. People don't realize how much they've lost already from population growth. Lost in the way of wilderness areas, for example, good streams to fish in, hunting, so forth and so on. The West knows something about this. People who've lived here for 30 or 40 years have seen a diminution of these goods. But the people in the eastern part of the country, never having enjoyed this, don't know that this has been lost.
Yet I had the opportunity this summer to travel in the Soviet Union for a couple of weeks. The Soviet government is actively encouraging ethnic Russians to have more babies.
Oh, this is a very complicated thing. By ethnic Russians, you mean the European Russians?
Yes, sir.
Yes, this is because they perceive that the Asiatic Russians are breeding faster and are now sort of sweeping west and replacing the Western Russians. Now, Russia officially is against all forms of racism or anything that might be interpreted as that, so they don't dare say anything about the fact that the Moscow-type Russians are being replaced by the Asiatic Russians. Right. But the people in power know this, and this is why they're trying to encourage people in Moscow and Leningrad and around there to have babies, because they're not having enough. But I think they're probably not offering sufficient rewards to get the results they want.
Well, that's just one example that seems to work against what you're arguing, and another might be the Pope, who's been traveling in Canada the last few days, arguing vehemently against certainly not only abortion, but birth control.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's part of the problem. So are the Russians. So are innumerable other countries where the people in power, seeing this as a problem of political and military power, want more cannon fodder, more common people to use to ward off attacks by presumed enemies outside. And this, of course, is a devastating policy to continue following these days. And what the Pope is doing is something that is, sort of thing's been said for thousands of years and is no longer appropriate. It's fine in an uncrowded world, but now it's a recipe for disaster.
What happens, but I guess the bottom line here is that your argument is that there is basically no technical cure for this problem.
Exactly.
That it has to be cured on a country by country, almost individual by individual basis.
Well, country by country, but the country, if it's a sovereign country, can pass laws that will reward people for the sort of behavior they want. And if one reward doesn't do it, step it up. I mean, I said $500 a while ago. If that doesn't work, try 1,000. You see, no matter what it is, you can always increase it until finally you get the results you want.
What happens to our human morality, if you will, in the course of practicing what you've called lifeboat ethics? What happens to us in this country who enjoy the good life as compared to most of the rest of the world? What happens to our sense of the value of human life or the value of helping someone if we practice what you're suggesting?
That's a good question, but I say that this is the way mankind has lived for almost all of his existence on Earth. It's only been in the last 100 years that there has arisen the illusion that the rich countries can save the entire world. I mean, this is an illusion. We can't. Even if we do all that we can, we will not succeed. It's just too great. So we have to adjust to reality, and I think if one has a high regard for responsibility of sovereign units, regards that as a prime thing to encourage, then you see that what you're doing is a very moral act. You're encouraging other countries to take responsibility where they claim sovereign power.
And you see very little help coming from, say, the United Nations or some organization like that?
No, the United Nations, by virtue of its charter established back in 1943, I guess it was, or 44, the only way that United Nations could get started was to have a charter that kept it from being anything but a debating society. And I mean, Russia wouldn't have joined, probably we wouldn't have joined, many others wouldn't have if it had any teeth in the charter. But it has no teeth in it, so it's just a debating society.
You mentioned a moment ago that it might take 3 generations of re-education in this country.
Yeah.
Do we have that long?
No, we don't. And that's why I think a reward system would be better. We can put we're willing to accept rewards right away. We're not willing to accept punishment. See, that's what we've had long practice resisting in the Prohibition era, for example, and so on. You try to punish people, and they will turn out to be very sneaky.
So we don't have a terribly long time to grapple with these problems.
No, the crunch is not going to get terribly much worse in our country soon, whereas it will in other countries, and we should at least at this point realize that we cannot solve the problem for other countries, and if we'll refrain from making mistakes there, that'll be a great step forward.
You were, Dr. Hardin, active in the 1960s and 70s in the effort to legalize abortion in this country, primarily because of your concern about the population question?
No. During the time I was lecturing on abortion, I refused to lecture on population because I didn't want anybody to make the connection, because I saw abortion as a woman's right issue. You see, and this is independent of population. So I only talked about the rights of women and why it was to the interest of the community to give women the right to control their own body. That was the only grounds on which I presented it.
And I read in the newspaper today that you're thinking of sort of re-entering that political question.
Yes, because of the rise in strength of the so-called pro-life group, which of course would like to reinstitute abortion prohibition, which we used to have. And I think this would have a disastrous effect now because we have a vast number of medical men who are now skilled at abortion, who've performed them, who've gotten used to the idea, who are anxious to help women in this way. We have a large population of women. The majority of women are in favor of abortion as needed. And so we'd have this large population, literally the majority of the population, who would be determined to violate a prohibition law. This is one of the worst laws you can pass, is a prohibition law where most people don't like it.
But in your view, this is purely a question of a woman's right as opposed to a question of a way to practice birth control.
No, it's part of birth control. In fact, abortion is the only method of birth control.
Perhaps I more correctly should have said population control.
Yeah, no, should not think of it in terms of population control. Population control is a function of a community. A family, a woman, can only practice birth control. And the question is, does the community have any reason for discouraging a woman from practicing birth control if she wants to practice it? And I maintain in this crowded world, the community has no such interest. If she wants to avoid having a child or delay having a child, other things being equal, this is in the interest of the community.
Is the anti-abortion side of this issue, are they making a significant comeback in your view?
The polls don't indicate it. They've had a great comeback in scaring the legislators to death. But this last session of Congress, the legislators did, in effect, realize that they simply cannot yield to this, and they bottled up in committee amendment after amendment after amendment that was offered of a pro-life sort. And they want to get it out of the way as interfering with the legislation. They know that that legislation, even if it passed in Congress, and if this is a constitutional amendment, could probably never be approved by, what is it, 2/3 of the states. And if approved by 2/3 of the states, all it could lead to would be another prohibition era with all the evils of that. So they don't want to pass it, but they're scared to say no because they'll lose votes. And so you cannot get many of the legislators to be honest about this.
Right now in Washington, many politicians are running and hiding from the immigration issue as,
right.
as the Congress tries to deal with that issue too.
No, right.
You have some thoughts on that, I know. Would you drastically limit or just outright prohibit immigration?
Oh, I think we should always have a policy of permitting some immigration, but the number admitted should be determined by the United States, by the receiving country, and not by the sending countries. In other words, it should not be their need, but our need or our willingness to accept immigrants. And the number should be limited, and this sounds like stating the obvious, but we should limit it to legal immigrants. At the present time, it's very easy for illegals to get in, and the present legislation that's offered is an attempt to make it difficult for illegals to get in. And I don't see how anybody who is in favor of a viable country can be in favor of illegal anything, immigration or anything else. To have anything illegal is bad. So let's see if we can't stop this so that whatever number we decide on, and that should be a thing we can argue about, whether 200,000 a year, 400,000 a year, 600,000 a year, whatever the number is, see to it that we have a system that limits it to the ones we've decided to accept.
And should we be particularly selective in who we allow in?
I think politically we'll have to be non-selective. In other words, it doesn't matter who you are, numbers are numbers. I certainly think it would be a mistake to allocate numbers on the basis of political pressures right now. For example, hemispheric numbers, to have more from the Western Hemisphere than the Eastern, right, because it's nearer us and so on. I mean, this is would be the result of a particular pressure group in the Western Hemisphere. I don't think that should, it should be our need rather than the sending country's needs.
We just have about 20 seconds left, but in all of the programs that I've done here over the years, I've never talked, I believe, directly to a politician about population and the magnitude of the problem. When are we going to be able to get the politicians to talk about it?
Well, there are a few now, like Dick Lamb, who will talk about it.
The governor of Colorado.
The governor of Colorado. He's not running for a national office.
Maybe that's why he talks about it.
Right.
Dr. Hardin, it's been very good to talk to you. Thank you. Fascinating.
Well, it's a pleasure being here.
That's our time for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
Funding for Idaho Reports is provided by the Friends of 4, 10, and 12, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by a grant from the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation.